His life was a rags to riches story. Swaggart would rise from humble beginnings to become a household name by building an enormous following and a multi-million-dollar ministry, preaching on the airwaves.
For over 70 years, she stood beside the most controversial preacher in American history. She watched him rise, fall, and rise again. She endured scandals that would have destroyed most marriages. She stayed when the entire world told her to leave. And when Jimmy Swaggart finally drew his last breath, Frances Swaggart did not crumble. She stepped forward, looked the world in the eye, and revealed what nobody expected. The Father's Day that changed everything. On the morning of June 15, 2025, a day that fell on Father's Day of all days, Jimmy Lee Swaggart was found unresponsive inside his Baton Rouge home. He was 90 years old. His heart had stopped. His son Donnie and other family members rushed to his side and took turns performing chest compressions on his lifeless body, desperately trying to bring him back before paramedics arrived. Emergency responders managed to restart his heartbeat and transported him to Baton Rouge General Medical Center. But Jimmy never opened his eyes again. He never regained consciousness, and the family knew deep in their bones that the miracle they needed was slipping further away with every passing hour. That same evening, Donnie Swaggart stood before the congregation at Family Worship Center, the church his father had spent decades building from nothing, and said something no one in that room was prepared to hear. He told them, without sugarcoating it, that without a miracle from heaven, his father's time would be short. He called Jimmy his rock and his hero, and his voice cracked in ways that the congregation had never once heard from the Swaggart pulpit. The ministry released a statement urging the world to pray, and within hours, it spread across every platform. Churches on every continent organized emergency prayer vigils for a man whose voice had shaped their spiritual lives across generations. For 16 agonizing days, Jimmy lay in the intensive care unit surrounded by Frances, Donnie, his grandson Gabriel, and a rotating circle of ministry staff. Spokesperson Megan Kelly repeated the same gut-wrenching update day after day, that there had been no significant change. The family described themselves as being in a holding pattern, which is really just a polite way of saying they were watching someone they loved slip away in slow motion with nothing they could do about it. Then, on July 1st, 2025, the announcement came. Brother Swaggart had finished his earthly race and entered into the presence of his Savior, Jesus Christ. America's longest-running televangelist was gone, but it was not the ministry's carefully worded statement that shook the world to its core. It was what Frances Swaggart chose to do next, and what she revealed publicly for the first time, that left millions of people stunned into silence. The woman the world underestimated. Most people who followed the Swaggart story over the years saw Frances as the loyal wife, the woman who stood by her man no matter what. And while that is technically true, it misses the real story entirely. Frances Swaggart was never just standing by anyone. She was running things behind the scenes in ways that most of the public never fully grasped. Frances Anderson was 15 years old when she married Jimmy Swaggart in 1952. He was 17. They were kids from the backwoods of Louisiana, with nothing except faith and a stubborn refusal to quit on each other. Jimmy had felt a calling to preach since he was 8 years old, and Frances believed in that calling even when every reality around them said it was a dead end. Jimmy turned down a recording contract from Sun Records, the same label that had launched his cousin Jerry Lee Lewis into rock and roll superstardom. Sam Phillips himself wanted Jimmy as the label's first gospel artist, but Jimmy chose the pulpit over the studio. That decision cost them dearly. Jerry Lee was reportedly earning $80,000 a month, while Jimmy and Frances survived on $30 a week. They lived in church basements, pastors' spare rooms, and motels that barely had running water. Their son Donnie was born in 1954 into a family that could barely afford to eat. Frances traveled with Jimmy as he preached from the back of a flatbed truck across small southern towns. She played piano, handled logistics, and managed the books when there was almost no money to manage. When the ministry started growing in the 1970s, Frances was the one quietly building the infrastructure that would turn a struggling preacher's dream into a global empire. What most outsiders never knew was how deeply Frances controlled the business side of the operation. Former insiders have described her as the true operational backbone of Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, someone whose understanding of finances, media, and strategy surprised even seasoned executives. Some within the ministry privately called her the Iron Lady because her authority on key decisions was absolute. By the mid-1980s, the Swaggart empire was generating an estimated $150 million a year. The ministry employed 1,200 people. The Baton Rouge campus housed a worship center, recording studios, broadcasting facilities, and a Bible college with 1,500 students enrolled. And behind every one of those operations, Frances was making decisions that kept the machine running. She would later step into the spotlight through Frances and Friends, her daily show on Sun Life Broadcasting Network, where she discussed theology, politics, and cultural issues with a bluntness that earned her a massive following of her own. That loyalty and that power were about to collide with a betrayal so public and so devastating that most marriages would not have survived a single day of it, let alone the decades that followed. The scandal that should have ended everything. The destruction of Jimmy Swaggart's empire did not start with a motel room on the outskirts of New Orleans. It started with a vicious war between rival preachers who were more interested in destroying each other than saving souls. In the mid-1980s, Jimmy Swaggart publicly accused fellow televangelist Jim Bakker of immoral behavior, helping bring down Bakker's PTL ministry. He then went after rival preacher Marvin Gorman, accusing him of sexual misconduct. Gorman was defrocked by the Assemblies of God, and his career appeared finished. But Gorman was not going to disappear quietly. He hired a private detective to follow Jimmy Swaggart, and what that detective captured on camera would blow the largest televangelist ministry in the world apart. In 1987, the investigator photographed Swaggart entering and leaving a rundown motel in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, with a woman named Deborah Murphy, worker from the stretch of Airline Highway known for its cheap motels. Murphy later told reporters that Swaggart had visited her roughly 20 times. She said he paid her to perform various acts and to pose without clothing. She made an even more disturbing allegation, claiming Swaggart once asked her to bring her 9-year-old daughter along, a request she refused with fury. Murphy later posed for Penthouse magazine and gave interviews describing Swaggart in deeply unflattering terms. When Gorman confronted Swaggart with the photographs, the televangelist knew his world was about to collapse. On February 21, 1988, Jimmy Swaggart stood before a congregation of over 7,000 people at Family Worship Center and delivered one of the most watched moments in television history. Tears pouring down his face, his voice breaking with every word, he said the phrase that would define him for the rest of his life. "I have sinned against you, my Lord. I beg you to forgive me." Frances was sitting in the front row. The cameras caught her face as Jimmy wept. She did not cry. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She absorbed the full weight of her husband's humiliation while the entire world watched. And if you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, you know that the hardest part is not the betrayal itself. The hardest part is having to process it in public, with no room to scream or grieve or ask the questions that are tearing through your chest. The Assemblies of God ordered Swaggart to undergo 2 years of rehabilitation, including a full year of no preaching. He initially accepted, then rejected the terms, and resigned from the denomination shortly before they officially defrocked him. He later paid Gorman $1.8 million to settle a defamation lawsuit. Then, in 1991, it happened again. California police pulled Swaggart over for erratic driving in an unregistered Jaguar. In the passenger seat was a woman named Rosemary Garcia, who identified herself as a worker. She told officers that Swaggart had panicked when he saw the police car and swerved while trying to shove adult magazines under the seat. This time, there were no tears. There was no confession. Swaggart stood before his congregation and told them flatly that the Lord said it was none of their business. The audience somehow applauded. Through both of those scandals, Frances stayed. She did not file for divorce. She did not issue a public statement distancing herself from her husband. She did not walk away, and the world could not understand why. What Frances would later reveal about those years told a story that most people had never even considered, one that reframed the entire Swaggart saga through the eyes of the only person who truly understood who he was behind closed doors. The comeback nobody believed could happen. After the second scandal, the world treated Jimmy Swaggart like a punchline. Phil Hartman impersonated him on Saturday Night Live. Late-night hosts made his name synonymous with religious hypocrisy. His audience collapsed. The Bible College lost its accreditation. The ministry that had once generated more than $500,000 every working day was bleeding money and credibility at an alarming rate. But Frances was not interested in what the world expected the Swaggarts to do. She and Jimmy did not retreat from public life. They retreated into each other, into a painful and private process of rebuilding that would take years before anyone saw the results. Frances has spoken about nights they spent crying together, praying for forgiveness, trying to reconcile how a man who believed in his calling could repeatedly betray the principles he preached from the pulpit every Sunday. She admitted they were broken people, but she insisted that brokenness does not disqualify a person from purpose. The comeback was slow. In 1995, Swaggart launched the Sun Life Radio Network. Then, in 2009, the ministry launched Sun Life Broadcasting Network, a 24-hour Christian television channel that would eventually reach over 280 million viewers globally. Jimmy hosted The Message of the Cross. Frances hosted Frances and Friends. Donnie preached regularly, and their grandson Gabriel, who entered full-time ministry in 2002, became an increasingly central figure. The ministry was smaller than the 80s peak, but it was alive. Jimmy wrote nearly 50 books, sold over 15 million gospel records, and recorded more than 100 albums while continuing to preach multiple times a week well into his late 80s. Then, just 12 days after his 90th birthday, Jimmy walked into the recording studio one final time for a session that nobody knew would be his last. The final recording and the goodbye nobody heard. On March 27, 2025, Jimmy Swaggart sat down at the piano alongside vocalist Joseph Larson and recorded an album called Where the Roses Never Fade. The orchestration was completed months later at Ocean Way Studios in Nashville with the Nashville Recording Orchestra, and that session took place in August of 2025, after Jimmy had already died. The musicians in that room knew they were finishing the work of a man who was already gone, and the emotional weight of that hit everyone involved deeply. In the weeks after that session, those close to Jimmy noticed a shift. He was still preaching, still showing up at Family Worship Center, but a quietness had settled over him that the people who knew him best could not ignore. He was more reflective, more emotional, more willing to say things he had kept locked inside for years. And what Frances later shared about those final weeks exposed a version of Jimmy Swaggart that contradicted nearly every public perception of the man. Frances breaks her silence. When Frances finally stood before the congregation after Jimmy's death, she did not deliver a polished media statement. She spoke as a widow, not a ministry figurehead. She appeared at Family Worship Center and said that Jimmy was not just a preacher to the world. He was her life, her partner, and her greatest blessing. She paused multiple times to steady herself, and the sanctuary fell into a silence so deep that you could hear the grief filling the room like something physical. Frances spoke about a side of Jimmy the public never saw. She talked about a man who prayed late into the night, who wrestled with doubt while preaching certainty, who agonized over whether he had done enough with his life and whether he had reached enough people. She told the congregation that he kept asking her if he had done enough, if the people he had not saved would weigh against him, and that she told him over and over that he had done more than enough. She acknowledged the scandals without flinching, calling herself and Jimmy broken people who were used by God in spite of their flaws. She described nights spent crying together, the agonizing process of rebuilding trust, and the private devastation that public shame inflicted on their family. She admitted there were moments when walking away seemed like the only rational choice. Yet she stayed, not out of obligation, but because she saw something in Jimmy that the cameras never captured. What stunned the audience was the way Frances completely reframed the Swaggart narrative. She did not present Jimmy as a fallen hero who found redemption. She presented him as a deeply flawed human being who never stopped trying, never stopped praying, and spent the final years of his life quietly trying to make peace with every person he had hurt. She said he did not want to leave any unfinished business, that reconciliation had become his private mission. She described finding him at 3 in the morning, sitting alone at his piano, humming old gospel hymns in an empty room. She said she knew he was saying goodbye in the only language he had ever truly mastered. And what makes that so devastating is the loneliness of it. A man who spent his entire life surrounded by crowds, choosing to say his most honest farewell to an empty room in the middle of the night. Ministry spokesperson Megan Kelly later said the family genuinely could not comprehend a world without Jimmy in it, calling the experience incredibly hard, but saying the family never once questioned God. The funeral that followed drew thousands, but the real significance was not the mourning. It was the transfer of a legacy from one generation to the next, and the weight of that transfer was heavier than any sermon Jimmy Swaggart had ever delivered. The legacy that refuses to fade. The funeral services stretched across 2 days at Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge. On Saturday, July 12, 2025, a public viewing and wake ran from 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. The hours had to be extended because the turnout overwhelmed every expectation the family had. Hotels surrounding the church were fully booked. People flew in from across the country and from overseas to pay their respects to a man they had never met in person, but who had shaped their lives through a television screen. On Sunday, July 13th, a celebration of life service was held at 6 in the evening. Pastor Gentazen Franklin, a New York Times best-selling author, was among those who spoke. The entire service was broadcast live on Sun Life Broadcasting Network and streamed across every digital platform the ministry operated. The tributes cut across every line of division that Jimmy Swaggart had ever provoked. Messages flooded in from village churches in the Philippines, congregations in Brazil, and individual believers who wrote that Brother Swaggart had saved their lives through a sermon they stumbled upon during their darkest moment. His music legacy alone was extraordinary. More than 200 gospel albums, over 20 million recordings sold, a Grammy nomination, and an induction into the Southern Gospel Music Association Hall of Fame. But the most important part of this story is not about the past. Gabriel Swaggart, Jimmy's grandson, now stands at the center of the ministry his grandfather built. He serves as president of Jimmy Swaggart Bible College and executive vice president of the ministry. He is 45 years old, married to Jill, raising 3 daughters, and the generational shift that Jimmy spent years preparing for is now fully underway. Frances has made it absolutely clear that she is not going anywhere. When people ask if she plans to retire, she responds with a quiet laugh and says, "Retire to what?" That the ministry is her life and that Jimmy may be gone, but the calling remains. Jimmy Swaggart spent nearly 70 years preaching. He sinned in ways that were broadcast to the world. He wept for forgiveness on live television. He was mocked and written off by critics and colleagues alike. He rebuilt what everyone said was beyond saving. And when the end came, it was Frances, the 15-year-old girl from Louisiana, who married a broke teenage preacher with nothing but a calling and a dream, who stood before the world and reminded everyone that the real story was never about perfection. It was always about endurance. and Francis made one thing crystal clear. That story is nowhere close to being finished. That is the story of Jimmy and Francis Swaggart, a story of faith, failure, and a love that outlasted everything the world threw at it. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what this story means to you.